Hello, Internet, and thank you very much for joining the Cloud Native Podcast YouTube channel. A show brings to you the latest update from Kubernetes and cloud native ecosystem. And today we're speaking about because we are actually closing the year, the last day of November, and we are approaching the last month of this year, December. And now it's a good time to understand the State of Container Security Report from 2023, and we will be talking about some of the aspect of on this podcast. So in year 2023, the Cloud Native Security and Usage Report declared that 87% of container image have high or critical vulnerabilities. The reality is there are too many vulnerabilities to fix, and team struggles with how to prioritize them. In fact, 85% of critical and high vulnerabilities have a fix available, but are not in use at runtime where they had to be exploitable. So in this conversation today, we will explore the dynamic landscape of containerized application with uninvited challenges and examine the year 2023 and find some interesting trends that may help you as you work to develop best practices and essential security consideration for ensuring the integrity and authenticity of your containers and your cloud native environments. So before any further delay, let's me go straight to Adrian Moat from Chain Guard, and I think is guest number 9 or 10 from Chain Guard on this YouTube channel. Let's thank you very much for joining us, Adrian. And first thing first, can you introduce yourself to our audience today and we have to be working on these days?
Hi there. Thank you very much for inviting me. So my name is Adrian Moat. I'm a technical community advocate at ChainGuard, which is basically developer relations. I've got quite a long sort of background in cloud native and security. So I've been talking on sort of this subject for a few years now. I'm very much focused on the container space, and I work at ChainGuard on sort of secure container stuff. So we produce containers with zero vulnerabilities or close to zero vulnerabilities. I'm working on telling developers and platform engineers, etc., all about that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much once again for joining us. So let's start about first thing first. We can actually explore some of the different aspect into it. So first thing first is I think we're now closing the year, last day of November as we are speaking. So first thing first, what are the most common challenges you actually face while working with the container ecosystem?
Most common challenges. Is that me personally or the industry, do you mean? The industry, I take it.
I think you can actually intersect both of them, personally plus industry-wise as well.
Well, I mean, at ChainGuard, we're trying to build our own Linux distribution. So that's obviously quite a lot of work, and trying to get all the automation and updating in place for that is, a lot of work. That's actually been a really interesting project. And it's been great to see like our Linux distribution Wolfie grow and develop and come to prove its usefulness. So that's been really great, but also very challenging. And we're very much focused on the challenges that we see in the industry, which is primarily around like CVEs. Like people really do worry about CVEs. People have started using these scanners, and the scanners have been a huge move forward. But the problem is, you run a scanner on a container image and it tells you you've got X vulnerabilities. But what do you do then? Like a lot of the time, you can't fix them yourself because they're in the base image and things like that. So that's where we've been. That's a lot of the challenges that we see in the industry and that we're trying to help with.
Yes, absolutely, 100%. And even if you look at the container security reports from different organizations, we see the numbers are actually intriguingly high. 87% of the container images have high or critical vulnerabilities, and team are actually struggling to find how to prioritize and fix them. And I think we should try to shift forward our approach to closing to zero CVEs, and that's where we see Cosine and plus Wolfie came into the picture. So can you share some insight into the how actually we are building containers today, and what is the role of Wolfie to shrink down the CVEs from 90% to the 0% CVEs? And what is the role of container signing into this whole process?
Okay, there's a few things there. It's all great questions. So Wolfie is our Linux distribution that I referred to earlier. So with our Linux distribution, like you said, we're really trying to get down to zero vulnerabilities. There's kind of a few parts to that. So one is we try to make our packages small and modular. So when we build images from container images from our packages, then they're still small, right? So like you may have seen other efforts in this area, like canonical rocks, which is where you take a dead package and you sort of slice it up. We instead use the APK format and sub packages. So we already have small packages from the start, rather than trying to reduce them after they're done. So that's one part. We try and keep things very modular and small. The second part is we're really, really aggressive about keeping our packages up to date. So we're always pulling in the latest release from upstream and applying it. Also, we constantly monitor for CVEs and so on. So if we find a CVE, what we'll do is we'll go to the upstream and see if there's a patch. If there's a patch, we'll use that. If there's not, we may look into the CVE, or we will look into the CVE. And in some cases, we'll either apply our own patch. In other cases, we may find that's a false positive or similar, in which case we'll issue an advisory. And that advisory will say, hey, we don't believe this is actually a problem, basically, depending on the exact issue. In other cases, we may say, hey, this is a problem, and then later on we'll update it when we have a fix for it, for example. So there's sort of a few techniques there. One is keeping things small, and two is keeping things really up to date, and the third one is issuing security advisories when you have to. Now, the other question was on cosign. So all our images are signed. So you can verify if you're running a Wolfie image or a chain guard image that it did come from us. Okay, so you can use cosign to go and look up the information on it with the cosign verify command and verify that was created by our GitHub action, basically. And that's really useful. So you can be, by doing that, you're sure that not only did the image come from us, that nobody else has tampered with it. So like even like lying on your system, nobody has changed it as well. So that's the kind of guarantees that cosign gives you on where that comes in. It's not so much in the side of vulnerabilities, it's in the side of like provenance and being sure about where you get things from and its provenance, and it's not been tampered with. Was there another part to that question?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. No, I think that's a very super conversation to actually we try our attraction right now around CVEs and this. So I think in the like when we see in the previous version, we don't have much of the solution available in the market around CVEs. We usually rely on container scanners to let them know how many things actually break in the cluster or can be exploitable. We can't do it. Then people working on there's a Trivi scanner, then the Sleek has a scanner, then the Docker has a Scout. So many things in here. Now we actually move our conversation to another point. Like we actually now we have a GitHub action, or that basically whenever you build an image, deploy into the production system, these GitHub action trigger in, and then actually lets you notify you that something actually can be exploitable, can you actually move in and fix this up. But now with the arrival or the existence of Wolfie, we will trying to make sure we will approaching a zero CVE. So a lot of the people who actually right now are listening to us can wanted to learn from you, like what is the meaning of approaching to zero CVEs. And sometimes people think, oh, will it be a possible, or will it be a design pattern, because we're removing all of the stuff for the container images. We end up having a very slimmer version. We don't have anything in the shell that we can actually troubleshoot or diagnose the issues. So these are the common challenges when I'm facing it. So I think there's three different question in here, but basically what is the meaning of zero CVE? First thing first.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's literally that. So the issue is with a lot of the images that are used at the minute, they're built on top of base images, and the base images often have vulnerabilities in them. And there's another whole side to it that when you build a container image and you use like a Debian or an Alpine package, you've got two or three steps in there. So say, for example, a vulnerability is reported on an upstream project. That upstream project may respond to that very quickly, but you still got a time delay between that vulnerability being patched and then Debian or Alpine picking up the new patch or the new release and creating a new release of the Debian or Alpine package. And then you've got another delay for whoever builds a container image, be it the Docker Hub or whoever, to create a new image based on that update. And so typically you'll find like it takes 2 to 3 weeks for a vulnerability to go from being patched upstream to that being released in a container image. Now, that will be short-circuited if it's an important vulnerability, but typically you'll find that's sort of the case. So that's one reason you find like images have vulnerabilities. And with Wolfie, like part of it, you're absolutely right, is that we have less software in the images, so there's less stuff to be vulnerable. But another part of it is just that we keep things up to date. So you'll find that even if you add the same packages that are in the Debian image or a similar number of packages, you'll still find that we have less vulnerabilities just because our stuff is that little bit more up to date. So yeah, if you go and try most of our images right now, you should find that there's 0 CVE.
Yes, absolutely. And I think on the topic like 0 CVE, which we spoke about wonderfully, beautifully well described, what do we mean by it? Plus, like, I think one of the way to go for the 0 CEV to make sure the base images that you're using for the container are secure enough and having a slimmer version into it. So how this Wolfie are packaging containers, how the Wolfie is actually packaging container today, and how it's actually different from the past where we have a very bloated size image. That's happened to me actually. When I start developing container images, we start actually using a base images that is 400 MB inside. Whatever strategy, even you use a Docker multi-stage file or any strategy you can use, but remember your base images is 400 megabyte and your other image it can be a 16 megabyte. When you think of how do we actually make it possible to have a 20 MB size, that's a big difficulty. That's a big problem in 2021, 2022. But we're now moving into 2023. What is the shift right now? How the people and Wolfie is actually helping slimmer version of the container images.
Right. So this comes down to like the distroless philosophy. So a few of you, or a lot of you out there, are probably heard of the Google distroless images. And basically what actually Matt Moore and Dan Lawrence, two of the founders of ChainGuard, did when they were at Google was they took the Debian image and they just chopped it down as much as they could. So there's almost nothing left in it except what you need to run an application. So some people out there will be saying to me, well, actually, I can run an application in the Scratch image, which is completely empty. And they're sort of right. You can run an application in the Scratch image if it's a static binary. But what you typically find is that most applications need a few more operating system components. They need things like CA certificates to talk over TLS. They need things like etc and /temp and /home, possibly need a user setup. So what the distroless image does is it just gives you those things, those very few things that you need to actually run a typical application. And so that was really great. Like you can use the Google distroless image and they have an image for like static, for static binaries, and they have an image for Python, I think, and they have an image for Java. But that's it. So there's a couple of issues there. One is, what if I want to add like another Debian package in there? I should really be able to do that, right? If my application has a dependency on this other thing, I would like to be able to add another Deb in there. Now that is kind of possible, but you have to mess around with the Bazel build, which I suspect a lot of people won't want to do. So what we did at ChainGuard was we said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to create distroless images, but we're going to rethink it and we're going to do everything from the start. And that's why we built Wolfie. And one of the tools we built is APCO or APKO. And this allows us to build images by saying, hey, we want a container image with just these packages in it. So unlike a Docker file, in a Docker file, you're doing like your from statement and then your run statement. And in those run statements, you're doing like your build and so on inside the actual Docker file. And we kind of separate the two. So one of the nice things about that is it means that I don't have to put a package manager or shell into my actual production image. It's very easy to create an image without those things if you don't need them. But I should also say, one of the great things you can do is use multi-stage builds if you're not using that already. So multi-stage build is where you separate your build steps from your production image. So your image to build your software and create your executable or your Java application or your Node application or whatever, separate that from the production image where you run it. And in your production image, you only have the executable itself and whatever dependencies it has, and you don't have all the build stuff. And that has a few great benefits. One, there's less in there, so it'll boot faster. It's also more secure because you don't have to have development dependencies and things like that. So that's a really great way to do things. And you can totally use our chain guard images in a multi-stage build as well. You don't have to use APCO to build your images.
Oh, absolutely, 100% agree with you on that. So I 100% agree with you, Adrian, on this point. And now I think we can circle back our communication to this angle. So how do you approach the identification and remediation of container image vulnerabilities in your environment?
Yeah, so most people are using the scanners that we talked about before. So there's actually an interesting question there. And one of the things that I think has been a little bit of a talking point over the last year is where should you do the scanning? So some people argue that you should be doing the scanning, developers should be doing it, right? We should be running scanners while we're developing images. And other people say, well, no, why don't we run it in CI? And then other people will say, no, why don't we run it on like ingestion into the cluster and refuse to allow containers to run if they have critical vulnerabilities, for example. And yeah, it gets very complicated. One thing that I've really liked over the past year is Docker's approach to it, and also Snyk have done some work in this area as well. I should say before I go on, although those are two of my favorite tools, ChainGuard are partners with Snyk, and I'm a Docker captain, so I do have a slight bias there. But Docker Scout, one thing that will tell you is the layer that a vulnerability comes from. So for example, if I'm developing an application and I've been given a base image either from my own platform team or I'm using an upstream base image, and it's the newest version of the base image, there's nothing I can do about the base image, then I can ignore the vulnerabilities in that layer because that's, it's arguably not my problem. It's somebody else that I need to lean on to fix that, or they need to take care of it themselves. Instead, I can focus on what I can control, which is my application, and make sure there's like no vulnerabilities that I'm bringing in. I think that was something that we missed in the sort of the first iteration of security scanners, because it would just give you a whole big list to go through, and you had no idea where that vulnerability had been brought in. So I think that's one really good technique to take to triage vulnerabilities. So yeah, don't focus on the base image if that's not your concern. If you are a platform team, of course you should be focusing on the base image. Yeah, and identification, yeah, it's exactly as you said. It's scanning tools, I think. There's great free ones like Gripe, but there's also great paid ones like Docker Scout and Snyk.
Yes, absolutely. And I think like right now, some of the developers actually arguing with us, like when you actually add something in the development life cycle in front of developers, like they write code, they build an image, and they're running the scanners, and they actually do a bunch of other cool stuff before deploying the production, they might think, how do you balance security measure with the need for agility and rapid development in containerized environments?
Honestly, in most cases, Like, I mean, that's a big thing, right? Security should not get in your way. We've kind of failed if security gets in people's way and slows them down. Honestly, I think, for example, if you're using smaller images, you should have a faster development cycle, right? You should be able to create and deploy your images faster. So in that way, security should actually be speeding you up. Um, but yeah, I'd be, I'd be interested to hear about specific cases where security slows people down. I mean, there certainly are cases. For example, like say you have policies and a mission controller that's checking everything, and then you get something wrong, and you got to go back and fix things and redeploy and so on. That can certainly get frustrating, but I think the answers there lie in templates and secure templates to get people started. Actually, that's another place where Docker have been innovating. They have like the Docker init commands that I think are really quite nice, where you Docker init and it'll create a Docker project for you that has a sort of best practices built into the Docker file already.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think like some kind of consideration already in place. And as you mentioned, good, I'm totally up to you. Like having a smaller image size, having a zero vulnerabilities in it is actually faster you up. Like previously you have to shrink something up. You don't have any tools available, and now you're thinking about it. Now I wanted to learn from you what trends or shifts have you observed in container image vulnerabilities in 2023? Basically, I want you can look at this question like, which are the ways you have noticed more ways that people introduce CVEs in their containers in 2023?
I'm not sure of a good answer to exactly that question. Let me talk about a couple of trends, maybe. I think that's another part of that question. So one thing I have heard people talk about a lot, and I think it's a very strong point, but I have a few misgivings about it. So a lot of people I've heard saying recently is, okay, your image has 100 vulnerabilities, but how many of those are actually exploitable? And quite
Yes.
often the answer is going to be 0 or 1 or 2 at most. Even if they're critical, quite possibly there's no way an attacker could actually ever get to that code path. And that's true. My problem with it is, how do you know if which of those vulnerabilities are relevant? Like, there could be one of those vulnerabilities is significant and is exploitable and could get you hacked. And trying to figure out which one that is almost impossible, right? So I think it's much better to try and get rid of all CVEs, especially if you can do it without too much work, for example, by leveraging Wolfie and chain guard images, than it is to sit and play a game of roulette with your CVEs, for example. What other trends? I did have let me check my notes. Oh, so I know you were talking about the SysDig report, but this morning somebody sent me the Huntress report. I can maybe post a link for that later. One of the things I found interesting in there, related to CVEs, or more related to attacks, was they claim that when attackers get into a system, they've now moved away from using custom malware. So they're no longer using bespoke tooling. Instead, they're trying to just use tools that already exist within the system. The idea being that it's easier to go undetected because you're not introducing new binaries that could be detected, for example. And so I think that again points to, and this is sometimes known as living off the land, and that again I think points to the importance of cutting down the number of utilities available in an image or a VM even. So if you have less tools there for an attacker to use, they're going to have a harder time exploiting a vulnerability. Yeah, I
Yes,
think that was some points.
absolutely, 100%. And I think we spoke about so many times cosine in the conversation here, and people are thinking, what is that, and where we find out. One thing I really like about Chain Guard team is they actually build a wonderful. You have a built-in terminal, then you actually try and practice how to sign the images, how to work with the images without deploying any Docker desktop or any container tooling. Just start working on the terminal inside the education dot edu dot chain dot dev. So that is one of the you can learn about how to sign a container with cosign. So that's one of the link to actually go through it as well. And also, I think you spoke about Hunter's blog post, and there's a link for it to people actually look at it and see some of the interesting facts about container security today as well. So I think like you draw on a wonderful conversation here. Now, I think you also spoke about chain guard images in the conversation. So, if somebody really new to this, I think a lot of the people are already familiar with how the chain guard images work, where they actually live, how the what the purpose behind it. For if somebody really new to this, can you tell people how the chain guard images are different from already millions of images out there with the different distros, and what are the best advantages, and why somebody want to replace their images with chain guard images?
Right. So basically, our images are focused on being security hardened and close to zero vulnerabilities. And we have images for most common applications like Nginx, Redis, MariaDB, etc., etc. So all our images are created from the Wolfie Linux distribution we've been talking about. We have two variants. There's the latest version and latest dev version. The difference being that the dev version includes a shell and package manager. So you can use it in a Docker file and add in more stuff if you need to. I should say our images are compiled against glibc, so although they're very small, and we use the APK package format like Alpine. Unlike Alpine, we're not compiled against Muzzle, which I know has caused some organizations pain in the past. We're purely glibc for compatibility reasons. But yeah, basically, in most cases, I would hope it's a drop-in replacement for the upstream. If it's not, please let us know and we'll try and improve things. And also, it should be compatible with, we have versions that are explicitly compatible with Helm charts and can be dropped into Helm charts and so on. So in a lot of cases, you're going to find that you can just replace your images with a chain guard equivalent, and it should work the same. I should say, for full disclosure, like we have like a latest version for free. If you acquire a version like 3.1 or an older version, that's a talk to us, and we'll get you a license for that. One important point there is, like, if you need a license for an older version, we'll keep that up to date. So, if you need Acme Soft 3.1, and currently it's 4.0 is the current version, we'll keep the Acme Soft and 3.1 for you, but we'll keep everything else in the image up to date. So one problem you sometimes have with container images is that the older versions of images have the version of software you need, but everything else is also getting older and accumulating vulnerabilities in the image, and that's not something you want. So really, you want even old versions of software to be rebuilt, if you see what I mean.
Yes, absolutely. And here's the link for the chain guard public images on the GitHub repository. You can actually take a look at it and try it out. And I see I have actually using all of my demos tutorial into the chain guard images. And something love about is that it's so fast. The build size is actually optimized. It's just a click, is a speed of just a click of a button, and things are working so smoothly. So that is a place for you to actually explore more on the chain guard images in the GitHub repository. And also, I think some people or some developers might have a question right now, because previously what they did is they tried to use some kind of Docker techniques, like you have a multi-stage Docker file, like you have a build in one step, runtime in another step, and production in another step. You basically divide your build into the three different stages, and making sure your image size not actually become a very bloated one. Some people might be thinking, some developer right now might be thinking, if they are using chain guard images, do they need still those ways to like still they need to do a multi-stage Docker file, or is it enough? Like you start using it, chain guard images, and rest is fine. Let's make out of one Docker file and start doing this kind of thing. I have seen these questions, and you're the good person to asking. I think. What is your key takeaway on this conversation?
Yeah, I would still think about having a multi-stage build, because your production image is always going to be different and have different dependencies from your build image. Even if that's, I mean, you can think just about debugging tools and like development versions of things. You might have more login turned on in your development version and things like that. So I would always keep those separate. It is a bit more work, especially at the start. But yeah, I would definitely try and keep the build and production images separate.
Yes, absolutely. I think in many cases that is going to be a very feasible approach, because one of the approach is to shrink down the image size, and one of the approach is to actually shift your code into the production, and you wanted to make sure that it will be actually in an organized way. And a multi-stage Docker file is actually a one of the handy way to craft your images. And one of the best way to actually shrink down your image sizes is to replace your image sizes with the chain guard images, because they are very slimmer in version. I can actually you can actually take a look at the repository in there as well. So now we're moving our conversation to the Kubernetes aspect of to it, and then your key consideration moving into the 2024. So in Kubernetes space, what are you like in open source in open source softwares, in open source projects? All of the people are actually running the software in Kubernetes cluster, and Kubernetes has their own images. Those are actually right now, if people are actually interested, they're actually signed using cosign. So all the Kubernetes images are now using cosign to sign their images. But in Kubernetes umbrella plus the open source ecosystem, what are the different challenges you see has actually arises? And plus in 2024, what your prediction would be? Where is the trend is going to moving going forward?
So like, what's the question around Kubernetes and what are the current challenges with security?
Yes, absolutely. Basically, in open source software, you see a lot of the open source like Argo CD, Flux, they are all using some sort of third-party libraries, third-party images, and all of the other software, open source software in CNCF ecosystem are using that. Most of them are shifting toward the cosign to sign the images. Many of the open source project. Plus, I think the question becomes this: what is the trend you have seen in the open source community, in the open source debates around the ecosystem of the latest challenges around securing the base, securing the container vulnerabilities?
Right. I mean, I think that's just the same, like vulnerabilities in containers in general and in Kubernetes. The Kubernetes based images, there is a look. They have been looking at using distroless and similar approaches. And again, like I would happily talk to any ecosystem project about moving to distroless images, whether it's our own images or even Google distroless or similar. And certainly people are starting to do that. Honestly, I think that the issues are largely the same. Again, it's more about keeping stuff up to date. Right?
Yes.
A lot of these are run by maintainers who aren't necessarily paid to maintain these projects, even with critical infrastructure projects. And they have a hard time keeping all their dependencies up to date. And it's not a trivial task. And so you'll find that upstream projects produce their own container images that are consumed within Kubernetes, but they're on base images that are out of date, for example, which is it's frustrating, but it's understandable at the same time. So one thing I would really like to see is a bit more automation and slimming down of images within the ecosystem, and trying to keep things a little bit more up to date. But it's not easy, and it's unfair in a lot of ways for us to ask these unpaid maintainers to do more work.
Yes, absolutely, 100%. And I think final thing, like we spoke about some of the um, subset of the container security space, but have you actually find some security best practices or some standardization that is actually you have noticed being happening more and often than not? So what are the best security practices that you think will become some standardization in moving forward in 2024?
Right. So I should caveat this to say, like, I am very focused on container builds, and I've not really played with Kubernetes that much in the last year or two. Having said that, I think I've seen a lot more movement towards admission policies and controllers. Um, so it used to be we had something called pod security policies, and that's gone away, and we're much more focused on admission controls and so on. So you want to be able to say, hey, only run pods in my, or only run containers or pods in my cluster that, for example, do not run as root is a common policy that definitely makes sense. And I think that's becoming more and more common. I believe there's been a lot of movement in network security policies as well. So you can lock down which pods can talk to each other and things like that, which is another great thing. RBAC's come a long way in the last few years from where it was to begin with. So we are getting closer to sort of secure multi-tenant Kubernetes. To begin with, there wasn't a lot of security around multi-tenancy. Now that's got a lot better. I'm sure it still has some way to go, but it's certainly made big steps.
Yes, and final question where you will be busy moving forward next year in 2024 in terms of some conferences you are actually planning to attend and in some of the speaking opportunities you are looking forward to in 2024.
I'm always open to speaking opportunities, so thank you very much for having me today. Yeah, KubeCon EU and so on is always a big one. It's incredibly hard to get into KubeCon these days, so well done to anybody that manages it. I believe it's only like a 10% acceptance rate. I'm part of the KCD UK. We will be running KCD UK in London again next year, or that's the plan at least. I maybe pre-announced that, so that was a scoop there. What else? There's a State of Open. That's coming up in January. That's organized by Open UK. I always love the Open Summit, Open Source Summit conferences. I'm not sure if I'll make it to those or not. Yeah, all conferences are great.
Yes,
GoTo is always a great one, and there's a few of those in various cities.
yes, absolutely. And as you mentioned, case study UK has become one of the very big case study event happening in the Kubernetes ecosystem. We have seen some wonderful speaker in there, like so you have actually named some of the big some tech leaders, some best tech leaders will be in the case study UK. That will be in the horizon of the people if you're actually watching or listening to us on this channel. So make sure you actually join virtually or in person because that's a very packed tech leader in there as well. So, a very final question, and then we'll let you off is what have you seen actually blown away from security space? And what if one thing we actually notice is actually a birth of 2023 in container security ecosystem? What is the birth of container security ecosystem in 2023? What have you seen very new that actually just recently came up in 2023? And what is actually blown away? Like is will be there in 2021, 2023, but now is actually duplicated. It's gone away.
Oh, gone away. I don't know. So one thing I think we've not talked about that is always been talked about a lot is SBOMs, which is software bill of materials. And there's an interesting debate about SBOMs. I'm probably of the opinion that the kind of table stakes all software should have an SBOM, just because they can and it makes sense. But the problem is, what do you use an SBOM for? And SBOMs are only really useful if everything has an SBOM. So what I think we'll start to see is more regulation enforcing SBOMs. And then after that, perhaps they'll become more useful and we'll see more tooling that makes use of SBOMs and it actually becomes a really useful tool. Because until that happens, there's not a lot of benefit from having SBOMs right now. The other thing that we haven't mentioned, and it's going to be big in all areas of our industry, is AI. So if you're at DockerCon, I should have mentioned DockerCon in the conferences, although I'm not quite sure what's happening with DockerCon, which is next year. But DockerCon came back this year, and it was a great conference. But one thing they announced there was an AI module for Docker, and it's really quite nice. It's really good at like answering your questions, helping you out with problems in your Docker file, and getting sort of quickly started with Docker. But if Docker has a plugin for VS Code that's AI, and what else is going to have a plugin for AI? Is AI going to take care of our security posture, for example, and suggest places that we should be improving the security of our Kubernetes manifest, for example? I think it probably is. So there's going to be big changes next year.
Yes, absolutely. That's a use case I would love to see companies and communities and open source project will be going more forward to, because right now we can actually predict, because there's so much happening in this container security space, and sometimes 90% of the people are doing the same mistake. And I think AI is one of those things that can actually we can take those inputs and see something bad happen, and there's a fix available, click on it, and that the issue is resolved, rather than actually spending time in the admission controller. Oh, forget, do not deploy this thing upfront because has some exploitable CVEs. Why are we telling people upfront in the development environments? These four things have already see fix available, is that you hasn't been actually aware of. I'm aware of it. Let's click on it, deploy them stuff, change 3 4 lines of the code, and forget about other things as well. I think definitely the AI become a big player in the security space as well, because usually we see, like, one of the questions I'm answering asking you, like, in the conversation, like, if you add more and more security measure in your pipeline, the developers say you actually making up less agile, less productive. I have to make these 7 different steps in order to deploy my stuff into the production environment. So having AI fix those gaps, the developers are really, really helpful, because AI can reduce the cognitive load associated in the development life cycle as well. I would love to see more and more stuff in the AI space as well. But thank you very much, Adrian. Will really enjoy the conversation with you, and hopefully in next year sometime I will invite you some hands-on stuff as well on the container SBOM. And I think one thing we haven't spoke about is OpenVex, a new
Yes, yes.
standard as well. And that is the conversation is available by the Perico Adolfo Garcia from Chain Guard, available on this channel. Go watch that as well, because they recently announced some new versions. I think some new releases in OpenVex as well. So that's another things happening, is that making sure you have false alerts sometimes. CVE is there, but doesn't harm you anything. And those CVEs have been picked by the container scanners because of some bad mechanism in there. So OpenVex is one of those standard. You have to take a look at it by removing false alerts from your scanning tools as well. So these are the bigger umbrellas you have to take into the consideration. But Adrian is your go-to resource if you want to learn how to shrink your images, how to make sure the image size is actually those things we actually adding in the images that will use in the production system, other than then remove it. Make sure to replace your image with the chain guard images. Make sure to sign your images with cosign, record fulcio from the SIG store ecosystem of tooling. And remember, now we also did a podcast on open pub key versus SIG store. Make sure to watch that as well, because you have some question which one to choose. That's already been covered in this YouTube channel. So we will looking forward to seeing your chat in the YouTube description. And as soon as I find some question in there, I will ask Adrian to answer those as well. So with that, thank you very much for tuning into this channel. Hope you liked the conversation. See you again sometime soon. Stay safe, stay healthy. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye bye.